Okay, there's a lot to go through and to be said. So I'm going to more carefully, now that I think I've covered borderline in its internal recesses. Um, at least I've scoped it out and laid it out, uh, all of the moving parts. So now I'm going to move on to the kind of the social connectedness, or the units that they form culturally, or and so this is going to have huge sort of political, analogous, parallels, that can be drawn from this, and I'm going to use political examples as well, um, and ideological parallels. So I'm going to go into those things, but I'm going to focus mainly on, let's say, the the enabler of the borderline, or rather the grooming, the groomed and conditioned, um, uh, entranced, you know, uh, the the person who forms part of the den, of this constructed environment that, uh, and how that environment is pushed in that direction, or how a particular target is pushed in being complicit with the borderline, internal structures, um, and also some of the aspects of variation within that general spectrum, of direction of progression, um, and then again this is going to have ideological parallels and political parallels. um, Okay, so that's generally the subject that I wish to go into, and then there was something else that I wanted to touch on as well. So I'm going to go through all of that. I can't remember. Perhaps it was to talk about another condition. Anyway, okay, I'll just deal with that. So what I've already described, um, both ideologically and in the case of psychological borderlines, is that, they're what they have in store for their host or their target, um, is a form of, hybridized, uh, histrionic, sort of, valence, or they condition their host to be a kind of hybridized, histrionic. Now, what I mean by that, in some sense, is that I think what effective, and again, it's hard because, these words, do they even mean anything? They're just labels, and I've used them consistently, but let me just try to define it from the ground up, so that at least if I'm using the wrong word, the substance is still there. So what I have defined histrionic to be, in some sense, is that essentially there is a fraud within the inner child, on the level at which, uh, unconscious belief structures, which always become unconscious, are are fundamentally fractured. They're fundamentally, um, disintegrated. Um, they don't function as a holistic intellect, in some sense. So there isn't a full pie, in some sense, to begin with. That there are bits of the pie that are missing, and they're sort of lost in the woodwork, as it were, and so there's missing accountability. The notion of responsibility has somewhat been ceded to some kind of external heuristic, some kind of external locus of control, some kind of external authority, and then essentially to plaster over and to sort of, verify that state of affairs, which usually has other beliefs about sort of excusing that kind of, um, those kinds of belief mechanics, the excuse for that kind of belief mechanic is usually just kind of convoluted and conflating into a kind of a bit of a jumble, into a bit of a confusion, into a bit of a kind of environmental condition, some kind of systemic oppression even. And essentially the thing that covers over that, or that represents that, or becomes the sort of the face of defending that, is this almost psychopathic ego function, which then has to sort of, in an exasperated tone, in a hysterical moral certitude and self-righteous sanctimoniousness, basically set up a boundary to say, this is justifiable. We can be certain about this, and usually this has to be justified through a kind of greater collective conditioning or something like that. It's like, and essentially, for example, in the ideological sense, identity is what facilitates this. Allyship, you could call it. Sympathy on a grand scale. A kind of intellectual sympathy, a secondary intellectual sympathy that then covers over and conceals the intellectual fraud of the missing accountability and the missing responsibility and the missing reasoning that just isn't there in the system. It's just it's a hodgepodge of a certain confection. Now, this is how I've described cerebral histrionic. Now, how does a borderline get this from somebody else? And in some sense, the thing that makes someone a cerebral histrionic is that these are it's not as if they don't have a subconscious. They still have a subconscious and they're doing things with it, but it's a direct impression. It's a parallel impression of these sympathetic structures of the inner child, intellectual dishonesty, and, let's say, the ego function psychopathy, or the kind of, or the crude ego functioning analysis that that the one hand washes the other. And so you've got this balancing act where essentially the inner child is being mirrored by the ego function, and they are both dishonest and they're both covering each other. And then the subconscious is just basically being the kind of being, again, a pale reflection of that sort of thing. And so essentially what cerebral histrionics in some sense do is that they're obsessed with this balancing act. They're obsessed that they're consistent on every level of each side of their mind, is like, has a sort of parity with the other sides of the mind, so that they can say, oh, look, my shoulders are even. Is sort of, there's the same chip on each of the shoulders, because in this metaphor there are three shoulders, because there are three sides of the mind that have to be symmetrically balanced. Okay, so now that's one thing to say. Okay, well, that's a cerebral histrionic. That's how they've sort of and in some sense, I think, these people they're made, I think, at around 4 or 5 years old. In the psychological realm, obviously the ideological hybridized sense, people can come to develop into it even after that age. And I do think it's probably woven into identity politics and ideology and political consciousness to a certain degree. Anyway, that aside, let me just talk about how borderlines condition people into that mode. So in some sense, I think they might already, in some sense, the kind of erosion that the borderline, the kind of attrition that the borderline structures already represent in terms of agitating their environment, or the kind of exposure that they are already structured to impose on others, is a kind of, in some sense, what I would like to say is what they're actually, the thing that I think almost creates this my description of a cerebral histrionic, at the least. I mean, perhaps also there's also something that is just histrionic, and it's not even cerebral. In some sense, I guess the cerebral histrionic is just the kind of like rationality rules in some sense, where he's just doing it in a particular specified realm, although he probably also is more broadly a histrionic as well in other faculties and in other departments of his. I mean, I can only speculate because, I haven't been exposed to him, but I can see how he supposedly thinks. I can see his pseudo-intellectualism, and so I call him a cerebral histrionic. So at least his histrionic tendencies have been deployed in that uh, uh, department, as it were. So, I mean, perhaps I shouldn't even be qualifying it cerebral histrionic, but I did, I guess, want to say something. I did want to put an adjective in front of it just to perhaps distinguish it from histrionic personality disorder, because I don't know if what I have just set up and described is completely different from how that is clinically ascribed. But anyway, so I don't know how to semantically just continue talking about this, but my histrionic description. Okay, so if someone has my histrionic description and they're not even okay, well, how they're going to get it from a borderline. So they get it from a borderline, what I would describe as having a psychopathic injury. In the same sense that people can have a narcissistic injury, I think what the borderline literally tries to do is they are taxing people's ego functions. That's what a borderline is fundamentally doing. And so they have to find a way to tax someone's ego function to essentially try to attach accountability to them, try to extract a sense of sort of, I've got you on the hook. I've got your integrity on the line. I'm taking your integrity and your accountability hostage. So they keep on sort of taking your ego function hostage. And then at the same time, they do something to your inner child. Let me think how to describe this. And I guess at the same time, they literally fragment belief structures at the same time. So they take your accountability hostage, and then they kind of overtly trample on your inner child or your belief structures, and they don't let you reconsolidate them. So essentially, they are pulling apart your belief structures while throwing these accusations against your integrity, against your ego function. And so in this fray, I guess what they hope is that you just kind of confect into a kind of emotional expression of anguish, a kind of emotional sort of yelp in your subconscious. And then as soon as you sort of make that yelp, then they know that they've sort of got the right sort of histrionic confection of vulnerability between your ego function. They know that they've got you in a kind of internal dishonor in some sense. And then essentially they have to sort of reify that yelp. They have to sort of condense that social expression into your mask, into your identity. And then they essentially map that within their virtual inner child. And they say, that's who you are. Now I've named you. I've named you that yelp. I've named you in the valence of that constructed engagement or whatever. And then they continue to plot you and relate to you in that context. And so they unilaterally control the subtext. And so, and you can, it was amazing. I was watching this thing that was published by the SABC News, so disgusting, giving fascists such a platform as this, and they had Julius Malema with three, let me say in his own words, three African reporters interrogating him about the corruption scandals surrounding his party and himself, and you can see the. I mean, I didn't watch the whole thing. I couldn't. It was just too toxic. But the reporters were after him. They were interrogating him, but just the kind of weaseling dishonesty, the kind of the overt bullshit, that the kind of nonsensical word games that Julius Malema was playing. It's just. I mean, I couldn't watch the whole thing to see if the journalists ever sort of actually narrated back and sort of reclaimed that kind of overt, um, in some sense, it seems to me that he exemplified in that series of exchange the kind of this overt narcissistic, this overt psychopathic injury that he's trying to land on these journalists into browbeating them, into scoring his cheap points, because this is what you get when you interrupt people, when you talk over them, when you break up what they're saying and you interpret what they're saying mid-frame and you give them conditions, and essentially it's all just unilateral, one-sided. He understands it and they don't understand it, and what they understand must be filtered through his canonical, I mean, it's just, like, so if a journalist uses an adjective, um, okay, well, how about these strategic text messages? Let's interpret these strategic text messages, for an example. Oh, they're not strategic text messages. Where was the word strategic used in the text messages? They cannot be called strategic if the word strategic was not inside the text messages. They cannot be called strategic because the word strategic was not actually in them. Like, what kind of fucking nonsense? It's absolutely insane. It's absolutely absurdly ludicrous. But like, how do you rejoin that? How do you rejoin such a bold-faced, sort of juvenile attempt to play nonsense word games and to kind of leverage a kind of uh, uh, control of the narrative in such a wise as to essentially inflict this, what I would consider a kind of psychopathic injury, um, and so essentially the psychopathic injury combined with an automatic sort of confection of what the scenario is, and a unilateral sort of narrative, canonical narrative about what the scenario is how essentially they dress you in a mask, in a subconscious mode of being, of thinking, that corresponds to this convoluted and sort of rough, uh, uh, um, I don't know what to call it. I need a geometric analogy. Uh, uh, Infidelity between the ego function and the inner child. So they are trying to confect this fundamental infidelity between the ego function and the inner child, tethering it to a certain sort of subconscious mask, which then they keep on addressing the mask. And they're essentially they want to bake your identity into something that intrinsically has this histrionic um, balancing act. And so essentially they can sort of force you into trying to, in an exasperated way, try to just keep at least the balancing act of essentially balancing the infidelity, so at least they can sort of save a dwindling spiral. So essentially they're trying to say they want to sort of put you into a position where you have to try to, in an excruciating way, do a tremendous amount of work that can just be sort of, that they can compel you to do just by leveraging new narratives at you and new problems and new word games or whatever, and nonsense, uh, anything, semantic contrivances, and just any kind of manner of manipulation, essentially just by self-reporting a narrative, or by constructing a story or whatever, or constructing certain half-baked syllogisms or whatever, because essentially the context it cannot be monitored, because the other person doesn't have an intact ego function to be able to actually, because essentially it keeps on being disrupted, it keeps on being interrupted, and essentially this confected infidelity between your ego function and your inner child is keeps on being leveraged against you, so that essentially the hope is that you will switch to that game where you will accept the lack of perfection in your ego function and your inner child, because so essentially they want you to say, okay, yes, I'll be humble enough to say that, okay, my ego function isn't perfect and my inner child isn't perfect, but at least they're symmetrical. And then they've got you, and then that's the histrionic henchman. That's the histrionic enabler that they are imposing. And essentially, I mean, this is essentially how the identity is meant to treat the Führer. This is how the collective entity and the collective camouflage and let's say the substrate of fascist culture is meant to adulate and fawn over and be the putty in the hand of the generative crafter, in some sense, that he is tending to the histrionic flock, as it were. Just as the borderline is corralling the target, the host, in the codependency, by essentially disguising the codependency as that the host needs me in order to keep this. Well, I mean, in some sense, it's more insidious than that, because I do believe that the borderlines, they know that they're all in it for control, and they need someone to control. Otherwise, what is life even for? In some sense, it's like what happens if you were a Führer, but you didn't have an identity to guard, to be the guardian over, to be the savior of, And never mind. I mean, it's interesting because in that particular interrogation, I mean, it's all about the corruption, and it's interesting because it's like, the bold-face ideological corruption, the moral corruption, the moral confusion given right at, oh, this is a black bank, so obviously it should not have been put under curatorship. I mean, the number of reasoned threads which are dropped essentially by the. Well, I only watched like 23 minutes of this, so I don't know if they ever went back to reclaim that and sort of and follow the flow of the argument, and to reiterate the flow of the argument, and to say, you have literally like gone back on your word essentially. Just because what you have said makes logical sense doesn't mean that it's reasonable. Everything that you have said in sequence relative to what you have answered it to or given a response to has been utterly nonsense, has been utterly bullshit. But somehow, his followers, I guess, don't care, because they're already in this mode of a kind of cheering on the mastery over the context. It doesn't matter that the context is inconsistent. It doesn't matter essentially they just want to live in a world where someone gets to control reality for them, just as essentially a borderline might. I mean, in some sense, borderlines are much more toxic than this, on a smaller scale, on an immediate scale. It's obviously much more unsustainable to be in a relationship with the borderline, because essentially they manage reality so badly that they have to have other people fix it for them in the background, and they won't even respect you or honor you for fixing it, because essentially there was not meant to be something to be fixed, because their masterful control was just meant to sort of sort it out, but it doesn't. And so they require a lot of extra work that will never be thanked, that will never be seen even, because essentially it that's not how reality is supposed to work. Reality is supposed to work according to how they feel, or how how the confused confection or whatever. But essentially, this is why they need somebody else, because this is how they like to relate to reality, and they need enablers in order to sort of dignify it in some sense. And ideologically, I mean, you can see that this is the so-called socialistic cohort, the so-called Leninistic, a sort of, I mean, they're all just variants of what I would generally call the fascistic mythos. Um, which is essentially that you have this canonical fatalism woven into this narrative, and as long as you have someone who is speaking the narrative into reality and, let's say, underwriting it with their charisma, then they become essentially the thing that everything else becomes a satellite around. The universe, they become the center of the universe for their hosts, um, that ensconce them, and that host essentially, which is the satellite in this example, they actually have to confront the real visceral grittiness of reality, and essentially, I guess, it's easier to defer that problem, uh, and to sort of diffuse it into the system when it's ideological. When you're actually dealing with a particular borderline, you realize how sort of insane it is, which is why essentially when you have this kind of cultural hegemon where fascistic values have and the fascistic way of thinking becomes in vogue, becomes the cultural hegemon, then essentially all the in some sense, you see, borderlines aren't good at maybe doing this on a collective level. They're not good. They're good at doing it on a psychological level, but they I don't know if they're capable of really plugging it into the ideological space. But essentially, there are enough pseudo hybrid borderlines in the ideological space, um, which I guess, maybe they were covert narcissists, and then they just kind of restructured their cluster B elements into this kind of constellation. Um, and so, what else? Did I go through everything I wanted to go over? But yeah, I just wanted to point out some of this, the style of this attrition and exposure that leads one into developing a kind of hybridized, um, hooked on sort of intellectual sympathy into the currency that is being manufactured, the intellectual currency that's being manufactured by the borderline, which is the only currency that you can do to try to level up your internal. Because then your ego function and your inner child, as a histrionic in this sense, as my description of histrionic, is fundamentally not infidelity, but all you can do is try to sort of level it up, um, by capturing elements. And in some sense, it's like a game. It's a bit of like a game where sort of you can try to become more like the Führer. You can try to capture the Führer's, um, power to mint the currency or something like that. That how can you capture the glory that is of the mastery of reality that is symbolized by the Führer, um, that has the power to narrate reality like that on behalf of the collective, on behalf of the ideological community, that they can confect reality as they so wish, just by labeling it into reality. Um, and you can see this very clearly in the, interrogation, that Julius Malema is very open about essentially stating the it's so laughable in some sense. He says, what is it? I don't. I've been personally audited so many times. I've had so many lifestyle audits by the South African Reserve, um, by the South African, revenue service, and then I have so the journalist asked him, okay, well then why not just submit yourself openly to a lifestyle audit, in essentially in the public, where then the journalist could go over it. And he said, oh no, there's no justification for that. So his prior excuse is was that he's already been through lifestyle audits, and he's been through many. And then so the journalist says, okay, well then why not just have one to clear up this VBS accusation and stuff like that. And then he says, oh no, there's nothing that indicates that would make that justifiable for me to submit myself to that. So I mean, he literally just used the excuse as that he's already been lifestyle audited, so that it's irrelevant. But then he says, well, if it's not justifiable, but somehow, then how was the earlier response, you know, pertinent? How was it even germane? So it's all these sort of these weird sort of cement. I mean, basically, it's inconsistent. He can be as inconsistent as he wants. He can be as inconsistent as he wants, and it cannot be reflected back to him. He'll just interrupt it. He'll just talk over it. I mean, I think those journalists probably should have at least tried, and then at some point, I mean, you do it by leaving an open question. Essentially, you say, well, then how is that a good response to that question if now you're saying this, and you just keep on phrasing it as an open question, and then when he gives essentially some absolutely bullshit little piece of rationality, you just say, this is a weasel way of talking, that this is nonsense, and then you get up and you walk out. That's essentially, that's the only thing you can do to kind of shine the light on the fascistic bullshit, essentially, or on the reality delusional. Anyway. What was I getting into? So okay, the actual mechanism. So I think essentially what the subtext is, in terms of the borderlines exposure, in terms of developing their target into being this kind of my description of histrionic, is that they are trying to extract from someone levers for their own manipulation. They're trying to say, give me the conditions that I can use to maneuver to compel you to believe something or something. So they want someone to offer them a kind of heuristic lever over their inner child. So essentially, the borderline is constantly saying, oh, you're unreasonable, or you're inconsistent, and so provide me the signs of your consistency, provide me the test that then I can use to game against you in some sense. So they keep on saying, just tell me what you want, just put down your conditions, just reduce it into a clear and simple thing, just make me understand, and then they'll play this sort of this ignorant, doting, sort of too simple, naive interlocutor, and essentially they are asking you to simplify something to make it too simple, so that they can use that too simple tool or instrument to further create this what I'm loosely calling a psychopathic injury. Because if they can land a psychopathic injury, then they can sort of obsessively get you to try to reclaim it by engaging with them on the subconscious level, where essentially they've consolidated a confected inner structure of what it is that you're representing, which is fundamentally in this humble position of internal infidelity, but it has to try to balance that infidelity, and so that they can sort of make you play their word games. They can make you follow through their maze, and essentially they can get you to agree with all the narrative that they're casting. And it's just, I mean, it's like watching a dark wizard cast, magic. It's a and this is this is the game that is generally being played, and a lot of what a borderline is doing, it's preparation for what I've called the House of Mirrors, where essentially they can share this present time space, and they can be the sole ego function, and your ego function can be the kind of the secret henchman that has to just do all the real work to make the central narrative true, and making the way straight for their subconscious machination of using their brittle subconscious uh, uh, present or present time um, puppet string uh, to be in control of everything. Obviously, the problem is that I think that control starts becoming resentful, because it always implies things which it never takes account of. It implies a lot of suffering. It implies a lot of, in the same way that Hitler was obviously unperturbed by the fact that he would make military decisions which would mean that, you know, uh, uh, German soldiers would have their eyelids frozen off, um, because it's sort of it's lost in the woodwork of the grand narrative, um, of this grand fatalism. Um, so the let me think. Yeah, so the subtext is completely manhandled constantly, and essentially, and then when you don't go with the flow of that subtext, that unilaterally imposed subtext, then you're always plastered with these false dilemmas, and it's okay, well then just tell me what it is that you're asking for. Give me the too simple heuristic, and then they can sort of masterfully show how what you're asking for is representative of the fact that you don't get it, or you don't understand it, or you're not living up to the ego function consistency that you are pretending that you have, and that they have the only ego function consistency and you have none of it. And essentially everything must, that you must understand them, and they don't have to understand you. It's that kind of asymmetrical, duplicative game that is the meta game that is being played through the substance. Um, so always the present substance, or the present content of whatever is happening, is just um, uh, is just representative of that meta um, complicity that is being enforced, essentially, and part of that complicity is the role that one person has all the understanding, and it's the other person's role to receive that understanding and to duplicate it, and there's no two-way duplication. That there is a difference between those who represent the principle of the Führer, and those who are just sort of ancillary um, witnesses, um, that sort of uh, uh, that the borderline is trying to essentially get their goad into having to reclaim their standing within the eyes of uh, this Führer um, orchestrated culture, in some sense. So then, if you buy into that reality, then the center of your reality really um, is whatever the Führer manufactures, is whatever the borderline insists that it is. And essentially, it's too much work to go against that, because if you go against that, then you get a barrage of decompartmentalization, of having to deal with hypothetical, nonsensical word games and confusions. And so essentially, I mean, what the borderline will often do, if they don't actually have immediate power, when they start getting power, it's literally problematic. Um, if they actually had a role of authority over other people, the people underneath them, watch out in some sense, because then you're going to live in a really disorientated reality, a really delusional space, a really hyper-realism that's going to just be infused with, you can see this probably in the newsrooms of all these journalists, all these activists, ideologically, anyway. Uh, um, where it's interesting, even if they might draw the line and say, okay, well, actually, you're not the Führer, but they still believe in the Führer principle in some sense. Uh, um, they still canonically view the world through these ideological instruments. They just say, okay, well, you're not. It's the same sort of idea that, I mean, Hitler was, let's say, culturally tolerated and popular, not so popular, not popular by his immediate majority. Even he was considered a clown. He was considered um, somewhat below the pale. He was only taken seriously by a few people, and only a few people, I think, saw the danger. Um, but essentially, it was believed that he would never be able to get power, because essentially his platform was just too pathetic and stupid. That it was obviously a kind of charlatan's game. That it was a kind of, it is exactly like what Julius Malema is. It is absolutely no different. Um, uh, why was I saying that? So the point that I wanted to make was, oh, that essentially, although people can culturally be impressed by this by the structure of reality, by this, essentially the idea is that, well, he is not the Führer because I have higher standards, and someone will come who will meet my standards, or some political force will approximate these standards at some point. Maybe essentially they're not willing to settle in terms of the Führer principle, but they believe that something will take the role of the Führer principle. Something should manifest to take its place. But they among the candidates available, there's not one that is worthy of the Führer role. But they canonically believe in the Führer role. And this is what you have, even people who have partially receded from identity politics, and from, the who have realized that there's something wrong with the illiberal values in this fascistic, totalitarian movement, and the kind of the cancel culture, and the confection of a liberal irrationality and unreasonableness. People that have already sort of said, these are problems. These people, I would still argue, probably have been conditioned, and they still have ideological grooves within them where they are effectively still captured by, what I would call them proto-fascists. That they are still probably culturally fascist, and they haven't disentangled themselves from all the ideological tendrils, as it were. Um, I mean, maybe that's too harsh. Maybe what I just said is a bit of an overreading, but to me it just seems unjustifiable that one can essentially know one. know the danger of this kind of these illiberal sort of values, and then still say things like, "Oh, I would still vote for Joe Biden," or something like that, when obviously the Democratic Party needs to be punished. It needs to die and be reborn. It needs to push the reset button. And so, how could you ever vote for something that is clearly way more? It's not even flirtatious. It has allied itself and amalgamated it itself with overt fascistic totalitarian culture and ideology. And to me, this is because they've already acclimatized themselves to some form of proto, essentially perhaps the environmental movement did it. The idea that no, they've got that mythos in their head that we need a savior. Um, we need to be cast into a narrative. We need to be cast into a grand polemic that we are just the little cogs of, or whatever. They've actually sort of fundamentally thrown the liberal conception of democracy under the bus, and they've said, just give us give us a paternal political force, and there's already so much paternalism baked into the system, sort of promulgating, you know, offering itself as the solution to the problem that it has persisted in maintaining. Um, so we've got lots of anyway. Now I'm making more cultural points, but okay, let me just make sure that I've gone over everything of how the borderline conditions their host. Yes, no, I did think I went over that properly. That they're always trying to condense from their target a way to game their complicity or compliance or compulsivity rather. They're always trying to find a lever of enforcement. And so if they are given by that person a model of their ego function, or kind of reduction of their ego function, a heuristic that's meant to supplement their ego function, then they have a mechanism in which they can invidiously inflict a psychopathic injury, or which is at least one of the biggest part of the puzzle to being able to have access to do that. So this is why they're always trying to extract some kind of reductive heuristic where they can sort of almost headline and label the other person's character or integrity of their character in that so essentially they can say, oh well, you said this, and then they can put a new context on it and then show it to be absurd in that context, and essentially their fidelity or their intellectual honesty in applying contexts is the opposite of intellectual charity. It's intellectual bad faith. They are just a bad faith machine to promulgate their own pontificated, self-realizing, self-satisfying, totalitarian, unilateral control of reality in their disgusting form of confected subjectivity, which then they say is the gift that they give to people. Join my subjectivity. It is the gift of the way out of this problem that I'm describing. Join my narrative. And so it's ironic because essentially this is always described as being, let's say, the answer to colonialism and the answer to grand narratives and systemic oppression, but that is exactly what it is. It is a grand narrative and systemic oppression. It is neocolonialism, is from the mouth of these fascistic demagogues, of these tyrants, which are fundamentally corrupt because the ideology that they weave is the deceptive craft of weaving corruption into their grand polemic. That it's the corrupt faculty that they afford to themselves is indistinguishable from the overarching structure, and that's obviously by design, because borderline, as well as this ideology, is a power game. It is a sense of a kind of self-assured solipsism, but it uses other bodies as human shields. It needs a host. It needs an identity. to be its ideological vehicle. Okay. Just as the borderline needs a codependent partner to enable it on the psychological version of this. But yeah, okay, that's gonna. Yeah, I don't need to say anything more. Yeah, I think that at least puts a finer point on what I see as the histrionic component of this, or at least my description of histrionic, um, and shows how, from the ideological side, you can imagine how the ideological, my description of histrionic personality disorder is basically what culture is now supporting in general. Okay, I need to elaborate some other further points which are important extensions of ancillary issues, and it will also go deeper into the histrionic and contrast it with covert narcissism, which is an important distinction that needs to be made. I hope I'm not distracted by the background noises that throw me off. Okay. So, what in my description of histrionic, I think I do need to distinguish that from covert narcissism. And then I think that distinction also gives a certain insight into a dimension or a way of decomposing the elements of the borderline therapy that I outlined. Which, I mean, it might be more of an intellectual framework that I've already sort of covered the substance of, but at least this gives it another way of maybe looking at it. But it might not actually be conducive for it is more of a an academic, sort of framing of intellectualizing the process, which might not be practical, but it's just an interesting ancillary way of looking at it. Okay, so let me get into it. And I'll probably make some political parallels as well, especially with the distinction between histrionic and covert narcissism. Okay, so in my description of histrionic, I think histrionic and covert narcissism are very, very similar in their components, but the biggest distinction is essentially in the primary sense of where the seat of consciousness lies. So basically, a covert narcissist, their seat of consciousness is predominantly in the inner child, and it is juggled between the inner child and the ego function. And essentially and they need both, because they need to sort of, the one hand needs to wash the other at some point. Sam Wagnan's description of covert narcissism as moving into the mode of a primary psychopath, and talking about the acting out that covert narcissism engages in is this seat of consciousness, which is either in the inner child or shifted to the ego function. Now, the thing that makes the histrionic difference, that makes my description of histrionic different, is that it actually has that same problem, that same infidelity that is being juggled between within the between the covert narcissist moving its seat of consciousness sometimes to the ego function, where it becomes a primary psychopath, and then back again, where it's getting wound up. Is that is that the histrionic has got that same structure within it, but it is being forced into expressing that inner structure, and it's forced into embodying its sense of being, or whatever, its seat of consciousness is resident in the subconscious. So it has to be the mask of that underlying representation. And so when it's forced to wear the mask that represents that those inner structures, it can represent them simultaneously. So it essentially it can try to create this sort of this perfect Venn diagram of having the inner child's intellectual dishonesty and the kind of and the ego functions intellectual inconsistency, and sort of just meld them together, confect them together into a kind of social atmosphere, an environmental culture of transaction or conventions that enshrine and and lay down the grooves in some sense. So the actual connections between people, the culture between people, the interrelatedness between people, uh, um, what has been normalized in that sense, um, and what is expected between social masks. So in some sense, it's woven into the manifestation of identity in terms of how people treat identity and treat each other. So the so the histrionic has got like a lot of the same structure, but they're representing it from the, in some sense, they're embodying it in a single side of the mind, and therefore they can sort of evenly draw from the other two sides of the mind, which the covert narcissist is somewhat cycling between, or juggling between. The histrionic is somewhat more stable in that they can channel from both side, from the sides of the mind the covert narcissist would be juggling between. The histrionic can just channel them in a confected mishmash of a kind of selective, sort of sense. This is problematic when this kind of histrionic is in the sights of a borderline, or is codependent with a borderline, or is part of a borderline sort of unit, or the extension of a borderline's entourage or whatever, as part of the entourage, is because that histrionic functioning is not preserved by the borderline's style of interaction, because essentially that environment that the histrionic is trying to maintain and preserve and subsist within is constantly having the rug pulled out from under its feet, that it has to double down, it has to sort of, because it has to push the reset button to sort of to incorporate the new version which is always being cast, because essentially it runs out of, the borderline runs out of narrative. The narrative that the histrionic will acclimatize itself to and normalize will then run out of resources, essentially, for the borderline to continue the concoction of its unilateral narrative, canonical narrative. So the narrative has to unfold, it has to sort of progress. And so this is why, for example, in Nazi propaganda, you get the conspiracy theory of the Jewish conspiracy evolves into being more insidious, into being, even when the Germans are winning the war and all the Jews are locked up in ghettos, and there's no interaction, still the Jewish infiltration exists because it's happened psychologically. It's just like the white privilege. It's like you're still colonized. It's sort of, it never ends. That the more ostensible progress you make, the more you have been undermined. It's sort of, it always just sort of escalates itself in its so essentially, in order to build themselves up as the salvation and the solution, and that the narrative is the guiding light towards freedom or whatever, the oppressive, the account of the oppression has to sort of unfold in usually in its usual hyper realism escalation. It gets more and more hyper real, and more delusional, essentially. And essentially this means that the histrionic is always on the wrong side of not being able to keep up. It's always, so it has to eventually becomes a kind of a very pathetic vessel, at least in relation to this borderline sort of circuit. Ends up becoming absolutely enslaved. That it's just, oh, just please just tell me what the latest external authority is for me to be imprinted by, for me to duplicate. Just tell me what the latest version of the narrative is, and I'll understand it. And essentially becomes a very, very quick, like it's a reflexive, you can see that the borderlines need someone who is responsive to their knee-jerk relativistic reorientation of the entire scenario. That essentially the latest feeling, and they cycled, and they end up accelerating their cycling through their through their valences, because essentially they have to keep the histrionic in supplication, in some sense. At least that's the ideological version. But let's say this is why I think generally this kind of ideological histrionic thing is only ever stable in the same way that I used to give all this analogy of a mafia morality, that it only works if you stay a subculture. It only works if you don't take over the whole system, because if you take over everything, then you are saddled with responsibility, and then you have to explain things. Then you're on the hook to actually have an understanding that should be consistent. Whereas if you stay the underdog, if you stay the subculture, then you can have this poisonous ideology, but you never have to account for everything. You can just say, oh no, we can never know the answer to that problem. We can never know the truth. The truth is impossible. So we just have this working ideology which doesn't. Okay, I was just interrupted by background noise, so I just need to think of where I am now. What was I just talking about? The mafia, the subculture. So essentially the narrative must take on a mythological form. It's the only way to keep it sustainable. The more it tries to sort of dignify itself with, let's say, ego function consistency, the more it has to sort of plunder the subconscious, the more it has to sort of bully the subconscious into just sublime, oppressive supplication. And the more words lose their meaning completely. The words are just completely, in the Orwellian, sort of description of newspeak and doublespeak and all those sorts of things. I'm not making the exact particular parallel, but anyway, it's in that general theme of things. Okay. It's embarrassing to say, I've never actually read 1984. I've only read excerpts from it and had long conversations about it with philosophy people and politics people. And I've read Brave New World, which obviously everyone should always say that sort of, it is a combination of. I mean, it certainly both have insights. Brave New World is actually becoming less prescient. The Orwellian thing. I mean, it's a weird confection of both. In fact, it's elements of the Orwell, but I mean, obviously, how could you try to tell a combined story of the 1984 and Brave New World? I mean, that's because that is what we're living in. In some sense, it's wonderful that we have both. It would be too difficult to try to concoct a story that resembles today's reality, which is a confection of both. But anyway, moving on. It would have been too hard the narrative itself would have been too hard to follow the themes. So it's almost better that the themes are divided between those two stories. But anyway, obviously, to get into the detail of how you could have a confection of both happening simultaneously, you need to go more into the psychological, and they were obviously, both writers were almost focused on a kind of sociological light psychology, light. Obviously, when you're dealing with the soul, you can get into the themes of the soul through sociology just as well, which gives you a certain reflective access to the psychology. But obviously the anyway, let me just continue. Okay, so I talked about the histrionic. Uh, yeah, so the mythology, the mythological aspect, in some sense, is more safeguarded if you stay a subculture. But if you try to say that your subculture should be the ruling the ruling hegemon, the ruling cultural hegemon, should be the model in which society is in the image of, and the organizational structure that society should be organized by and centered around. Then you get into this sort of this, well, I mean, it's been called, I think, a purity spiral and things like that, but I mean, these are the actual components that are making it spiral into further and further absurdity, and nonsense and unreason. um, okay, so anyway, I guess that was a small point about how its substrate is fundamentally mythological, and how the mythology is essentially only conserved by keeping it vague, by keeping it nebulous, by keeping it mythological. And then the more you try to sort of dignify it and dress it up as an actually consistent intellectual enterprise, and try to substantiate it, the more corrosive it becomes relative to the subconscious, which therefore the histrionic henchmen, the histrionic enablers, have to become more pliable, have to become more pathetic, have to become more hollow in their brittle um, supplication, in their attentiveness. Um, okay, so covert narcissists themselves, I think, would not make good. I think I do think I was correct when I said in my last video that I believe that perhaps borderlines themselves do not. Perhaps they could become field marshals in the ideology. I'm not sure. To me, it makes more sense that a covert narcissist would do that. That essentially the covert narcissist would be at home to creating propaganda and creating stable, semi-stable working mythologies and dressing them up in sophisticated intellectual trappings to stabilize the histrionic identity, or the histrionic, sort of model uh, that supports this ideological overarching borderline enterprise. Um, so there's that. So I think that it is the covert narcissist that effectively becomes the sort of the proto Führer, or at least is part of the Führer structure, or the manifestation of the Führer structure, when this appears in an ideological form. And this is the kind of pseudo intellectualism that we see in academia. That we have these people who have been bitten by the fascistic ideologue bug, and they were already sort of covert narcissists, and then they have just molded themselves into being part of this, trying to create this sort of this intellectual consensus that gives itself collateral support and props itself up. um, and then it's very hard to sort of uh, to refute them, because they can always just say, well, no, the other guy's got the right answer. And like, you can't expect me to defend this, because I don't stand for this. I just stand for a piece of it, and my piece of it is justified by also the other pieces. So it's the sort of it's I think a covert narcissist is very comfortable in making itself, is in sort of using this collective enterprise to essentially engage in the feeding trough of uh, of narcissistic supply. In some sense, this kind of ideology mechanism is the best way for a covert narcissist to actually achieve narcissistic supply. Although, in some sense, the narcissistic supply is perhaps not delivered to them; it's delivered to their functioning within the borderline, overarching, super uh, uh, super constellation of these apportioned things. So it's problematic because essentially, again, they won't be receiving the supply. It's going to be received to their role in terms of the Führer principle, essentially. So that's going to be problematic for them as well, because I don't think that they would actually believe the actual. I, and I believe that the Nazis themselves did not believe their own bullshit. They did not believe their own ideology. It was, in some sense, they had an idea. This is why they were so into the occult, because they had this idea of having a two state a they basically have an intrinsic segmented society where they have, this is the ideology that the plebs believe, this is the ideology so that we can all have peace in our society, and then essentially the best of the best within us will sort of rise to the top, and then we'll join the secret club, we'll enter into the secret ivory tower of elite. So they have a kind of occult elite that leads and secretly sort of does projects in this general sort of culture, which they don't even believe themselves, but which is just a useful form of control and management over the plebs in some sense. So it's, I guess, in some sense, it's like the difference between an exoteric and esoteric religious component, that it's like, everyone else is meant to be asleep so that the leaders can sort of be, so that the special elect can be awake or something like that. The problem is that I do actually believe that the SS did have plans to eventually cull the German population itself. That essentially, that they were just, why were they even there? They were just there because you need a buffer or you need to play the game against other countries. But eventually, if you take over everything, then only the elect must sort of. Anyway, they have this intrinsic problem in some sense, is that when does the culling stop? When does the purity refinement stop? And what do you base your criterion as well? Because essentially, if it is this covert narcissism, okay, this is too much of a tangent, but I've roughly sketched out that kind of problem, but this is the problem, is that when you've already allied yourself with this fundamentally game of stupidity in some sense, when you facilitated the counterfeit manufacturing of reality as a cultural staple, you become, I mean, it's almost a kind of demonic possession that your culture becomes prone to. While you're sort of feeding this weird kind of heuristic or this weird process, which sort of it cannot stop. When do you stop the process? It's like, when do you reach social justice? It's sort of like, at what point do you say, okay, that's enough? Because the process itself doesn't actually ever have an internal expiry date. It requires a kind of relativistic, subjective claim about objectivity, that enough has been done. It requires a paradox in order to stop. And so, like, when does the paradox get reached? Like when does it get satisfied? And it's like, it becomes, well, the semantic confusion is a reflection of that sort of problem. But anyway, okay, that's a bit of a word salad. Let me just continue. Uh, so what was I talking about? I was talking about covert narcissism being essentially the ones who take on the borderline valence in some sense, within the ideological sense. Okay, let me just go back to talking about covert and histrionic. So I guess I've mainly grounded this in the political, but essentially I think my descriptions are still correct. That also my description of histrionic, um, it needs to have a distinction being made. I mean, I understand Sam Bucknan's point that you just call cluster B with emphasis or something like that. That everything is just cluster B with different emphasis. But in some sense, I think that these patterns. I don't. I mean, I don't know how much I do believe that. I do believe that there's obviously migration and there's drift and there's an adaptation, and in some sense, certain structures can lean towards a certain spectrum of variance of presentation. Um, and they can sort of mold into mimicking other cluster B strategies or structures in some sense. But, and so the one can mimic another in some sense, but it'll always be a replica from that primary structure. And perhaps that primary structure can be eventually sort of overrun by a new primary structure. But I think that those primary structures, I guess I must think about that more in terms of what would the conditions be of legitimately having a primary structure being supplanted by a different cluster B primary structure. Um, if I just table that issue for now, um, I, I, I think that the primary structures, like all manifestations of the false ego complex, I believe are I don't know, you can call them self states. And the only reason to have any kind of self state in my ethical framework, let's just say, is to give you a window to resolving the false ego complex and gaining mastery over it. To me, there's only one objective. It is self actualization, you could call it, or you could self mastery or enlightenment or whatever. Self realization, as it's called in the Hindu tradition. Or in Prabhupada's translation of the Gita. Anyway, so so that being said, okay, and I just want to make the other slightly further points that histrionic is. I do think that histrionic, as I've described it, my description of histrionic, is the vast state of most false egos in some sense. That everyone is at some, usually at some form of histrionic in some sense. But this doesn't, maybe not to the extent that it's an entire personality disorder, but essentially they have histrionic elements because they have inculcated culturally within their social interactive masks or whatever in the grooves of their interrelatedness and transactional um, patterns. They have got inculcated into that essentially reflections of a of an armistice between or sorry a Venn diagrammed intersection of inner child intellectual uh, um, dishonesty and ego function intellectual inconsistency, and so they've got that confected into a subconscious aspect that they have. And in the same way that it's very hard to break these things down, it's very hard to actually shine lights on them. It's very hard to, because essentially part of the general culture that we have that facilitates that is, I mean, you could call it, it's problematic that you can't really define humility perfectly. You can't set up a perfect description of it. Because then essentially you would be able to contextually find a way to game it in some sense, to contextually delude it. And in the same sense, that's representing those heuristics is what the subconscious histrionic, in some sense, what the confection of that subconscious mask portends and facilitates. Okay, I just wanted to make that point about histrionic being a very pervasive presentation. Obviously, I guess if we say that, in some sense, maybe it's. I mean, I understand that people have moved away, perhaps even clinically, from diagnosing. I don't think people diagnose history. No, I guess they do, but they don't diagnose what I would describe as histrionic. Maybe the threshold should actually be a matter of degree and not of quality. So essentially, if someone should be considered histrionic, if within a certain sphere, I mean, this is a horrible way of defining it, because this is not even good enough. But let me just finish what I was going to say. Is that it contains the majority of that person's motivation or effort in their life, or something like that. It pervades over subject matter and substantive content, which controls a vast majority of their energy in some sense. Okay, that's a bit of a vague definition, but essentially, if someone is histrionic and only 5% of their energy is controlled by that histrionic structure, then essentially they're probably also capable of having that 5% dislodged much more easily by aligning the 95% to show the inconsistency with the 5%. But obviously it doesn't even work like that, because usually if anyone has any kind of histrionic component to them whatsoever, there are vast shades, there are vast layers of overlay which has made that possible in some sense. So there are vast nebulous self-deceptions that are helping to operate that space, even if that space is segmented in some sense. And some sense, I think Sam Harris is some kind of, at least analogous to this kind of variant, when I described him as perhaps having two totem poles, that the one is psychological free will and the other one is a kind of metaphysic that negates free will, and that gives him a kind of an out, that he's got these two overlays which he knows are qualitatively incommensurate, but which sort of he's given himself permission to try to find a best fit, and thinking that there is a solid solution to doing that, or something like that, kind of a confected matrix which then stabilizes everything, and that sort of keeps this issue, although he's actually probably mapped it to some degree, he's mapped it to some sufficiency, but I would say it produces the kind of disgusting performance that you get in that podcast 9 months ago, The Dark Horse with Brett Weinstein, number 8, talking to Sam Harris, where essentially you make 2-hour preemptive counter arguments because you can't have these structures be transgressed upon. Or uncovered, or what's the word? Or jostled, or sort of or just exposed, or to any movement, or something like that, because it's so delicate in some sense. There's a better word, but anyway, that's close enough. Okay, these are tangents. Okay, so Okay, let me talk about borderline therapy. I think I've covered this to death. The difference between histrionic and covert narcissism. Yeah, I think I've gone through everything. So the histrionic, their seat of consciousness is in their subconscious. The covert narcissist, the seat of consciousness is juggled between the inner child. It's predominantly in the inner child, and it's also in the, and maybe they can also find a certain, maybe the covert narcissist can find a certain Venn diagram where those two things overlap and produce a stable subconscious expression, which is something that is kind of rare for narcissists in general, to have subconscious expressions that have stable characteristics. Or I mean, when I say stable, I mean that are internally, I need to look up the words again. It's just embarrassing that I talk so much about psychology and I always forget the definition of these words. But you know, it's what the opposite of dystonic. That they have a subconscious manifestation, which I'll just phrase it in the negative, that keeps just that keeps their other structures from experiencing from undergoing any kind of dystonic pressure. So that if they have a certain Venn diagram, perhaps certain alignments between their ego function and the inner child, that they can have a manifestation of a subconscious which reifies a kind of internal structure and an internal consistency. But then also, I guess it would be hard to actually call them a covert narcissist in that moment, in that valence. But in some sense, the subconscious, that subconscious manifestation would in some sense, I think, no, wait, I want to revise what I just said slightly. Essentially, I think that subconscious manifestation would be like a persecutor, would have to be like a sanctimonious, you know, sort of, if you can imagine, like the Inquisition, would have to be sort of in the valence of an Inquisition. That in the process, in the procedure of an Inquisition, that their subconscious gives them a kind of internal structure or an internal coherence. But they have to be in that mode of that kind of prosecutorial function, which can allow their values represented by their inner child and their sort of intellectual consistency and reflectiveness over, you know, like they have to be this instrument of this kind of a kind of overarching process, which they are part of the facilitation of the kind of the fatalism implied by the narrative mythology or the narrative mythos, because they can't find, they'll never believe in the mythology, but if they can be in the mode of being the instrument of the mythology, then essentially they can see themselves as a kind of fatalistic necessity, which in some sense they can subjectively rationalize as that they are facilitating something that is the arrangement that the world is fundamentally in some sense. So it'll still map on to their value system, although it'll be covertly an expression of that value system. Speaking a bit too quickly, it might be hard to follow conceptually. I didn't even perhaps follow that myself, but so I guess covert in this sense means mimicry. It means like it means playing the part. It means acting along with it. So essentially, the reason why it would still validate their belief structures or their values is because their belief structures and their values are that there are no true identities. There's only playing the part. So they are playing a part, and they've found a stable mythology which they don't directly believe in, but which they indirectly believe must be managed, must be accomplished, because this gives them a stable role to play. And so if they can make themselves part of the guard, if they can make themselves part of the inquisitorial, what's a military term? Contingent. I'm trying to find a name that means like that they're actually part of a team, a wolf pack, the wolf tribe. That they have found a tribe to absorb their way of dealing with reality, or psychologically, that is integrated and facilitates their psychological workings. They found a tribe that facilitates that, and essentially, and then they become like a wolf pack, and then it's there to help them hunt. It's there to facilitate their. So they don't believe in the pack, but they believe in the hunt, and the pack helps them hunt. So, and the hunting would be like the Inquisition. So they need the Inquisition to keep the hunt in so and I mean, this is the parallel of the witch hunts, that if they didn't have witch hunts, they wouldn't be able to keep their psychology facilitated. Okay, I was going to move on to borderline therapy. So in some sense, we can see that the borderline, in some weird sense, is a yes. uh the borderline is a combination of these two component parts, in some sense, like that they want somebody else to be a histrionic, and that they are kind of like a covert narcissist, but they're a covert narcissist with a um, in some sense, the covert narcissist and the histrionic are two sides of the same coin, in some sense. And I would call the covert narcissist, and I think I have called this before when I was talking about the ideology, the fascistic ideology of identity politics, and that way of thinking, that the covert narcissist side of it, which I've also called the borderline side of it, is like the female component. And the histrionic, my description of histrionic, I've called like the male component, right? So there's the queen bee, the female covert narcissistic sort of wing of actually representing the content in the inner child and the ego function. And then there's the histrionic, um, the histrionic um, what to call it, corresponding, what's the word that means, compatriots. It's not exactly the word I'm looking for, but anyway, so these things are compatriots of each other. Consort as well, I guess. So this is the natural consort, is that you have the covert narcissist and you have the histrionic, and they are two sides of the same coin. The covert narcissist, I'll just nominally give them the gender female, because it does have this female energy. It does, and it's more borderline. Now, I mean this in a borderline context more so, but in some sense, this is how the borderline functions as a unit with their codependent consort, is that they will essentially, because they're more than covert narcissists. They're not just covert narcissists. They're covert narcissists that are meant to work with with my description of histrionic. They are meant to be codependent with this histrionic element. So the covert narcissist is merely revealing things about its ego function and about its inner child, and predominantly they are. The problem is that they don't just stick to one side. They actually use both voices. They use the voice of the ego function and they use the voice of the inner child, which is what actually sells them out in some sense. It reveals what their problem is. It reveals their internal. It reveals that the whole thing is rigged, as it were. And this is why I say that they should be considered more as primary psychopaths and not even secondary ones, because in some sense the only reason why Sam Vaknin calls them secondary psychopaths is because he says, well, they still feel empathy, they still feel bad about their inconsistency. Again, my definition of psychopathy is just inconsistency in terms of the ego function. But I would even say that they feel bad is just a way to keep the inner child voice alive, but they don't do anything about it. You know, they don't actually use their ego function to actually find a resolution to that. It's just an ongoing self. So in some sense, they're like, oh, we'll just play along then anyway, just so that I can stop feeling bad about myself. So, you know, it's almost like saying, well, don't complain. don't complain. I know that you have reason to complain, but just don't complain because it makes me feel bad. So when I continue to manipulate and coerce you, just don't complain about it, because then we just have this added component of me having to voice that I feel bad and guilty for the things that I'm doing to you. You know, it's like feel sorry for the sadistic manipulate for the torturer. You know, feel bad because, you know, well, someone had to do his job. Someone had to be the torturer. You know, it's like that kind of you know, so the torturer who's crying in his eyes as he does his job, and so you have to try to not to scream when he's torturing you. You know, that's the kind of that's supposedly the distinction between primary and secondary narcissism, is that essentially give more control to the torturer, because not only must you receive the torture, must you receive the imposition, the unilateral imposition, but you also have to be imprinted on that this is a real human being as well, and you must understand that what's going on is complicated. Uh, anyway, I could have covered that point better, but anyway, let me just move on and not rehash things that I've already sort of gotten into. So anyway, I would say that element is just there to keep the inner child voice alive, because if they just went full psychopath, then they wouldn't have the coercive tendril of the inner child anymore. They would sacrifice it. So they have to keep both alive. Um, and again, the actual valence of that inner child is constantly cycled out. It's constantly replaced by a new character, and it's not even the characters themselves that are applying the torture, but it's in their sequencing, it's in their deployment, it's in their sequence of deployment. It's sort of it's, you know, how they it's how they are chosen to be deployed, and then retreat and then are replaced by another one that essentially is this ongoing onslaught of attrition, so that essentially the subtext can be unilaterally imposed by the borderline, and the narrative can be concocted at will and edited at will and selectively edited in real time, and sort of re redescribed by the bundles of description, which somehow the inner child remembers everything when it's convenient. You know, like they have tremendous delusional memory of how everything happened to them, and you know, it's amazing just how warped reality gets in their memory, essentially, in order to keep these stockpiles of ammunition. um, you know, and it's always just too simple and too naive to curate and to have a consistent accounting of reality. Um, and so they use their negative emotion, they use their fragility on that level, they use their crying as they're sadistically torturing you to shield from having to um, have to represent persistent and consistent values and beliefs. So essentially, they can chop and change their beliefs in real time. And that's part of the overarching control, because essentially they just want to control the histrionic. They just want to control the male codependent target. So the histrionic is archetypally male. The covert narcissist, in the borderline context, is archetypally female, is the receiver of the service of the histrionic, and the histrionic is getting the narrative from the covert narcissist, is getting the context from the covert narcissist aspect.